The streets of the small town were quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that made the air feel heavy and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Shadows stretched long across the cracked pavement as a solitary figure moved through the alleyways, a skeletal dog. His body was nothing more than a collection of bones, draped loosely in a thin, matted coat of fur, stained from days of wandering. His eyes, once bright with life, had dulled to a dull amber hue, full of weariness and sorrow. His ribs poked sharply from beneath his fur, and every step he took seemed labored, as if the world itself was too heavy for his frail frame to bear. He moved slowly, the sound of his claws clicking against the concrete the only noise in the otherwise still night. People passed by, heads down, eyes averted, as though pretending not to notice the pitiful creature dragging itself through the alley. It wasn't that they didn't see him. They did. They just didn't want to. He was just another stray, just another broken thing to ignore. His mere presence was a reminder of how harsh life could be, a reminder of neglect, abandonment, and suffering. So they ignored him, passing by as if he were nothing more than a shadow. For days, or maybe even weeks, he had been wandering through the streets, surviving on scraps of food that people discarded or the occasional kindness from an elderly woman who would slip him a small portion of bread or a leftover bone. But those days were few and far between. Most people turned away when they saw him, frightened by his gaunt appearance, or simply indifferent to his plight. He had no name, no home, and no purpose. To most, he was just a broken animal, nothing more than a shadow to walk past. But tonight was different. The cold winds of winter were starting to settle in, and the dog had nowhere to shelter. He stumbled into the alleyway near the corner shop, his eyes scanning the ground for anything to eat. He was so weak, so close to giving up, that every movement took more effort than he could muster. His stomach growled loudly, but he couldn't summon the strength to care. His mind was foggy, and he found it difficult to focus on anything other than the raw, gnawing hunger that ate away at him. As he walked deeper into the alley, he spotted something. A small paper bag, tossed carelessly to the side. The faint smell of bread reached his nostrils, and for a brief moment, his instincts kicked in. He moved towards it, his pace quickening, but as he got closer, he felt a sharp pain in his leg. The injury was old, maybe from a fight or an accident, but it had never fully healed, and now it felt worse than ever. With a whimper, he sank to the ground, too tired to continue. The world around him spun as he lay there, too weak to move, too hungry to think of anything else. He closed his eyes for a moment, just to rest, just for a second. He didn't know how long he would be there. But in that moment, all he could feel was the overwhelming pull of exhaustion. Then a sound, a soft voice. "Are you okay?" The dog's ears perked up at the sound of the voice, a human voice. He didn't expect it, didn't know what to make of it. His head lifted slightly, and there, standing at the entrance of the alley, was a small boy. His face was filled with concern, his eyes wide, yet full of empathy. The boy was holding something in his hand, a small piece of bread. "Here, I'll help you," the boy said, inching closer, his steps slow and cautious, as though he didn't want to startle a fragile creature before him. The dog stared at him, unsure. He'd been mistreated by humans before. They had all abandoned him, had all ignored him when he needed help the most. He didn't know what to expect from this child, but there was something different in the boy's eyes. Something soft, something real. The dog hesitated for a moment, then, driven by hunger and a faint hope he couldn't quite explain, he crawled toward the boy and took the piece of bread from his hand. The boy smiled gently, watching the dog take the food, his eyes not filled with pity, but with understanding. "Don't worry, I'll take care of you," the boy whispered. In that moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, the dog felt something other than pain. He felt a flicker of warmth, of safety, of hope. And as the boy sat beside him, sharing his bread and speaking softly to him, The dog realized he wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in his life, someone cared. Liam had always been a quiet child, the kind who preferred the company of books or his own thoughts over the noise of the playground. His parents, though loving, were often preoccupied with their own struggles, financial worries, work stress, and their unspoken distance from each other. Home never felt like a place of warmth, and Liam had grown accustomed to seeking solace elsewhere. It was in the quiet corners of the town, near the edges of the woods, or by the riverside where he found peace. There, he could forget about the constant tension in his house, the fights, the awkward silences, and just breathe. At school, Liam was mostly invisible. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't bullied either. He simply existed, unnoticed. His classmates ran in packs, laughing and shouting, but Liam was content to sit on the sidelines, observing. He was observant by nature, noticing things that others often overlooked. A child with a torn jacket, an old man sitting alone on a bench, or a stray dog huddled in the shadows. All these things tugged at his heart. He always wondered about their stories, what they had gone through to get to that point. One chilly afternoon, as Liam walked home from school, he decided to take the longer route through the town's alleyways, the path that veered off the main road. He enjoyed the solitude, the quiet whispers of the wind through the trees, and the way the sun cast long golden shadows on the ground. It was on this route that he first saw the dog. At first, he thought it was just another stray, one of the many that roamed the streets. But as he got closer, Liam realized how wrong he was. This dog was different. His coat was ragged and matted, his bones visible beneath his thin fur. His eyes were dull, the once bright spark of life nowhere to be found. The dog was crouched against the wall, too tired to move, too weak to stand. He was a shell of an animal, and it was clear to Liam that he had suffered. The dog's ribs jutted out like sharp edges, his gaunt body a testament to the hunger he had endured. Liam's heart ached as he watched the dog. He could see the emptiness in its eyes, the resignation, as though the dog had given up on ever finding kindness in this world. For a moment, Liam hesitated. He had been taught not to approach stray animals, that they could be dangerous or carry diseases. But the boy felt something inside him, something that was both tender and urgent. He couldn't just walk away. He took a deep breath and walked slowly towards the dog, his footsteps soft, careful not to startle him. The dog, hearing the boy's approach, lifted his head just slightly, his eyes scanning the boy with the same wary distrust that all abandoned animals held for humans. He growled softly, his lips curling in caution, but there was no real threat in it. The dog was too weak to defend himself, too exhausted to bark or fight. Liam paused. He didn't know what to say, how to make this animal trust him. He'd never been good with animals before, never had a pet of his own. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just leave the dog here to suffer. He knelt down to the ground, lowering himself to the dog's level, his face soft with concern. "It's okay," Liam whispered, his voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." For a long moment, the dog stared at him. The air between them felt thick with uncertainty, the unspoken tension of two creatures, one human, one animal, trying to understand each other. Liam slowly reached into his backpack and pulled out the sandwich he had packed for lunch. It wasn't much, just a simple piece of bread with a little cheese, but it was something. He held it out, extending his arm carefully towards the dog. The dog's eyes flickered from the boy's face to the food in his hand, then back again. It was clear the dog was starving, yet something held him back. The dog was afraid to trust. Liam could see it in the way the dog flinched every time he moved. Liam sat back on his heels, not pushing, not forcing the dog to take the food. Instead, he simply stayed there, his hand still outstretched, offering what little he had. He spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." For a long while, the dog just stared at the bread, and then the bread again. It was as if time stood still. And then, just as Liam thought the dog might turn and walk away, the creature moved, slowly, cautiously. The dog's nose twitched, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. Finally, with a tentative movement, he stepped forward and sniffed the bread. Then, hesitating for only a moment, he took the piece of food from Liam's hand. The boy's heart soared as the dog ate, his eyes lighting up with a mixture of surprise and joy. He had made a connection, however small, with this broken creature. And in that moment, Liam felt something stir inside him, a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe this dog wasn't just another stray. Maybe, just maybe, he was the one who needed someone to care for him. And Liam knew, deep down, that he would be that someone. The following days were a blur of routine for Liam, but there was something different now. Something that tugged at his heart every time he thought about it. The dog. The stray. Every day after school, without fail, Liam found himself heading toward the alley, his thoughts focused entirely on the creature he had met there. His parents barely noticed. They were always busy, too caught up in their own lives to ask where he went or why he spent so much time walking the quiet streets. But Liam wasn't concerned with their questions. All he cared about was the dog. He had made a promise, hadn't he? To help the poor thing. To show him kindness, when the rest of the world had turned away. And so he went, every day, bringing food, a piece of bread or a scrap of fruit, unsure if it would be enough, but hopeful nonetheless. The first few times, the dog had remained elusive. Each day, Liam would arrive at the alleyway, his heart racing with anticipation, only to find the space empty. But on the fourth day, something shifted. The dog had been waiting for him, curled up in the same corner, his eyes barely open, yet still alert enough to see Liam's approach. Liam's breath caught in his throat as he saw the dog for the first time in days. The animal had gained a little weight, though not much, and the dullness in his eyes seemed to have faded, replaced by something softer, less fearful. The dog's fur, though still ragged, looked cleaner than before. It was small signs, but to Liam, they were victories. The boy approached cautiously, not wanting to scare the dog away. His heart hammered in his chest as he reached into his backpack for the food. This time, he had brought a small bag of biscuits his mom had baked that morning. He held them out, his hands trembling just slightly. He had no idea whether the dog would take it, whether it would even want to get close. The dog had never gotten so close before. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The dog's eyes flickered from Liam's outstretched hand to his face. The boy could see the uncertainty in the dog's gaze, the hesitancy that was so familiar to him. After all, the dog had been abandoned by humans once before. Could he really trust another one? But Liam wasn't going to give up. Slowly, he lowered his hand, letting the biscuits sit on the ground in front of him, just in case the dog was too nervous to take them from his hand directly. He took a small step back, sitting down on the cool concrete, his legs crossed beneath him. He needed the dog to know he wasn't a threat. Minutes passed. The silence in the alley grew thick, almost unbearable. Liam held his breath, waiting, willing the dog to come closer. And then, just when it seemed like the dog might turn away again, there was a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle. The dog took one tentative step forward, his eyes still locked on Liam, and sniffed at the biscuits. Liam's heart leaped. With careful, measured movements, the dog leaned forward and gingerly took a biscuit. Liam didn't move, watching in awe as the dog, despite the years of fear and mistrust that had been etched into him, allowed himself to take the food. There was no growl, no hesitation in his actions. For the first time since they had met, the dog was fully at ease, trusting the boy with his food. Trusting him, period. Liam couldn't help but smile, his face lighting up with quiet triumph. "You're okay, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're going to be okay." The dog's eyes softened as he chewed the biscuit. There was a small, almost imperceptible wag of his tail, too weak to be a full wag, but enough to be recognized. It was a gesture so subtle, yet it spoke volumes. Over the next few days, the visits became a routine. Each time, the dog was a little more willing to come closer, a little more open to Liam's presence. And with every passing day, the dog seemed to recover just a little more. His fur grew less patchy, his eyes less fearful. He began to sit beside Liam as he ate his lunch, the boy's presence no longer a source of stress or anxiety, but a comfort. One afternoon, Liam sat down on the cool concrete, his back against the wall, his sandwich in hand. He smiled as he reached out, offering the last piece of his lunch to the dog. This time, the dog didn't hesitate. He stood up, walked over to Liam, and gently took the food from his hand. The gesture wasn't just about hunger anymore. It was about trust, about acceptance. Liam sat still, watching the dog eat, his heart swelling with emotion. He didn't need any words to know what this meant. The dog wasn't just taking food from him. He was letting him in. And for Liam, that was enough. It was all he could ever ask for. In the silence of the alley, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows, Liam knew that something beautiful was happening. The dog was no longer a stray. He had a name, even if it was still unspoken. And he had a friend, someone who would never turn away. For the first time in what seemed like a lifetime, both the boy and the dog had found a place where they belonged. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Liam and the stray deepened in ways neither could have anticipated. What had started as a simple act of kindness, feeding a hungry dog, had blossomed into something far more significant. The boy, once a quiet, solitary figure, now found himself anticipating each day with a new sense of purpose. Every afternoon after school, without fail, he would make his way to the alley, eager to see the dog and check on his progress. And each day, the dog would be waiting for him, a little stronger, a little more trusting. Liam noticed the small changes first, the subtle shift in the dog's posture, the way his tail would wag ever so slightly when Liam approached, or how the dog's fur seemed to glisten a little more, even though he wasn't fully healthy yet. The dog was still thin, his ribs visible under his coat, but the weight of despair that had clung to him seemed to lift, little by little, as he grew more comfortable with Liam's presence. The boy had taken to calling the dog Scout. It wasn't a grand name, but it felt right, simple and fitting. The dog had the spirit of an adventurer, always alert, always watching, as if he were waiting for something more to come. Liam wasn't sure if it was the right name, but it was a start. It was a name that held hope. One afternoon, as the sunlight faded and the shadows began to stretch longer across the alley, Liam sat beside Scout, his legs crossed beneath him. The dog, now a little less wary, sat next to him, his body just inches away. For the first time, Scout rested his head against Liam's knee, his breathing steady and calm. The boy's heart swelled as he stroked the dog's rough fur, his fingers gliding gently through the coat. Scout didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He stayed there, content, trusting. And in that moment, Liam felt as though the world around them had disappeared, leaving only the two of them, together. As time passed, the daily visits became more than just about food. They were about companionship, about healing. Liam spoke to Scout as if he were a friend, sometimes telling him stories, sometimes just sharing his thoughts in a quiet voice. He didn't care if the dog couldn't understand him fully. It didn't matter. The words were more for Liam than they were for Scout. It was a way to connect, a way to break through the loneliness that often plagued the boy's heart. Scout, for his part, seemed to respond to Liam's presence. The dog would follow him around the alley, walking beside him as if they were two kindred spirits. And on days when Liam had no words, Scout would look up at him, his eyes soft and full of understanding, as if to say, "I'm here too." One afternoon, Liam decided to bring something special, a blanket his mom had given him when he was younger. It was old and a little frayed around the edges, but it still held the warmth of childhood memories. He spread it on the ground, patting it gently to invite Scout to lie down. The dog hesitated at first, unsure, but after a moment, he laid down beside Liam, resting his head on the blanket. Liam smiled and sat down next to him, pulling the blanket up a little to cover both of them. It was in moments like these that Liam realized how much Scout had changed. The dog, once a mere shadow of an animal, was beginning to come alive again. His eyes were brighter, his steps more confident, and his once haggard appearance was softening into something more familiar, more full of life. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Scout had found a sense of security, a place where he didn't have to be afraid anymore. And in return, the dog gave Liam something he hadn't even realized he'd been missing: a sense of peace, of belonging, of connection. But it wasn't just the dog who was changing. Liam, too, was evolving. With each passing day, he felt less isolated. The quiet boy who had once kept to himself now found himself speaking to Scout, sharing parts of his life that he had never shared with anyone before. Scout didn't judge, didn't criticize, didn't offer advice. He simply listened, his presence enough to make Liam feel understood in a way he hadn't felt in years. Liam knew the dog's healing process was far from complete. He was still weak, still had a long way to go before he was truly healthy. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the trust they had built, the connection they had forged between them. In each other, they had found something precious. Someone who cared, someone who would never turn away. And so, the days continued, each one bringing more growth, more healing. Liam and Scout had come to rely on one another in a way that felt unspoken, but deeply understood. They were no longer just boy and stray dog. They were something more, something that could never be easily defined. But that felt right, just as it was. The weather had turned colder as the days passed, and the first signs of winter crept into the town. The trees, once full of green, now stood bare, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. Liam had to wear a thicker coat when he walked to the alley, his breath fogging in the crisp air. But even as the temperature dropped, something about his daily visits kept him warm inside. Each day, Scout seemed to grow stronger. His coat, though still patchy in places, had begun to fill in, and his ribs were no longer as pronounced. He no longer staggered when he walked, and his once lagging tail had started to wag again, if only slightly. Liam noticed these changes every time he saw him, and each small improvement filled the boy with hope. Scout was recovering, and with each step, he was shedding the fear and pain that had haunted him for so long. It was as though the dog was being reborn, his spirit rejuvenated by the love and care Liam had given him. One afternoon, as Liam walked toward the alley, he couldn't help but smile as he saw Scout waiting for him. The dog was sitting near the corner of the alley, his eyes alert but relaxed. His tail wagged gently when he saw Liam approach, and the boy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't just that the dog had become healthier, it was that Scout had become a part of his life. No longer an outsider, the dog had found a place in Liam's world, and it was a place of belonging. Liam sat down next to Scout, letting the dog rest his head on his lap, as he often did. They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's presence. The boy absently stroked Scout's fur, his fingers running through the soft patches that had grown in since the first time they met. The warmth between them felt as though it transcended everything else. The cold of the weather, the distance of the world around them. "Scout," Liam whispered softly, his voice filled with affection. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" The dog's ears perked up, and for the first time, Liam saw a look of recognition in the dog's eyes, as though he understood what the boy was saying. Scout nuzzled his head into Liam's lap, his body pressing against the boy's side. And Liam smiled. He couldn't help but feel like this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that had the potential to change both of their lives forever. Later that evening, as Liam made his way home, he felt a growing sense of urgency. Something inside him told him that Scout needed more than just visits. He needed to be with him, to be a permanent part of his life. The boy hadn't talked about it to anyone yet, but the thought of Scout being left to roam the streets alone again, even after all the progress they had made, felt unbearable. It was time to do something about it. When he got home, Liam went straight to his room, closing the door behind him. He knew his parents wouldn't understand. His mother, though kind, was always concerned about adding more responsibility to their already full lives. And his father, well, his father never seemed to care about much at all. But Liam was resolute. He had made a promise to Scout, and he wasn't going to break it. That night, Liam sat at his desk, scribbling a letter. He knew it was a big ask, but he needed to make his case. His handwriting was neat, though his words were full of urgency and hope. He wrote about Scout's recovery, about how the dog had gone from a skeletal figure to a playful, trusting companion. He told them how much Scout meant to him, how much the dog had helped him heal from his own feelings of loneliness and isolation. And more importantly, he wrote that he couldn't stand the thought of Scout being left to fend for himself once more. When he was finished, Liam placed the letter on the kitchen table, where his parents would see it when they came home from work. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. Scout deserved a chance, a real chance, at a life without fear, without pain, without hunger. The next morning, Liam woke up with a nervous knot in his stomach. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the letter and what his parents might say. Would they refuse? Would they say no, that it was too much, that they couldn't handle another responsibility? He didn't know, but he couldn't keep the uncertainty at bay. He had to know. That afternoon, as the final school bell rang, Liam rushed home, his heart pounding. As he stepped through the front door, he noticed that his parents were sitting at the kitchen table. The letter was gone, and both of them looked up at him, their faces unreadable. "Liam," his mother said softly, "we need to talk." Liam's throat tightened, and he took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever response they would give. But to his surprise, his father, who had been quiet up until that moment, spoke first. "You've done a lot for that dog, haven't you?" he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Maybe it's time we gave him a home." Liam's heart leaped in his chest. He had hoped, but never expected. "Really?" he asked, almost breathless. His mother smiled. "Yes, really. We'll make sure Scout has everything he needs. But Liam, you're going to have to help care for him. It won't be easy." "I will," Liam said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I promise." And in that moment, as Liam's parents agreed to bring Scout into their home, Liam felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The boy and the dog had not only found each other, they had found a family. And that was just the beginning. The days following Liam's heartfelt plea were a whirlwind of excitement, uncertainty, and anticipation. Scout was officially going to be a part of Liam's family. But as the boy watched his parents prepare for the dog's arrival, he realized that bringing Scout into their home wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped. There were still obstacles to overcome and challenges to face, but Liam was determined. He had promised Scout a new life, a life where fear and hunger no longer ruled. And now he had to make that promise a reality. The first step was getting Scout to Liam's house. On the afternoon Liam had been waiting for, he returned to the alley with a leash in hand, his heart pounding in his chest. Scout was there, as always, waiting for him, his tail wagging slowly but steadily. "Come on, Scout," Liam whispered softly, kneeling down to clip the leash onto the dog's collar. "Let's go home." The dog, though still unsure of the new attachment, allowed Liam to lead him out of the alley. The leash, though simple, was a tangible symbol of the changes that had come into both of their lives. Scout was no longer just a stray dog wandering the streets. He had a place now, a home. As Liam walked beside him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment, but also a twinge of nervousness. What if Scout didn't adjust to his new surroundings? What if the dog was overwhelmed by the change, by the new smells, sounds, and people in the house. When they reached home, Liam was relieved to find that Scout seemed to take the transition better than expected. The dog hesitated for only a moment at the front door, as if uncertain about the new space, but after a few cautious steps inside, he seemed to relax. Liam guided him to the designated corner of the living room, where they had set up a bed, bowls for food and water, and a few of Scout's favorite toys. It wasn't much, but it was a safe space. Liam watched as Scout sniffed around the room, his ears perked and his eyes wide with curiosity. The dog seemed to take everything in, slowly settling into the space. He circled a few times on the soft blanket before lying down, his body still a bit tense, but visibly more comfortable than he had been in the alley. "Good boy," Liam murmured, scratching Scout behind the ears. "You're safe now." For the first time, Scout didn't flinch or pull away from the boy's touch. Instead, he leaned into it, his eyes softening with a trust that Liam could feel in his very bones. This was it. Scout had a home. And for Liam, this moment felt like the culmination of everything they had both been through. The hardships, the fears, and the uncertainties. They were both starting fresh. Over the next few days, Scout began to settle in. It wasn't instantaneous. There were moments when he seemed unsure, when he would pace nervously around the house or cower at loud noises. But each time, Liam was there, offering reassurance, speaking in calm tones, and showing Scout that he didn't have to be afraid anymore. Slowly, the dog began to show more and more signs of comfort. He would rest beside Liam while he did his homework, or lie near the couch when the family watched TV. It was as if Scout was learning that home wasn't just a place, it was a feeling. But there were still challenges ahead. Liam's parents, though supportive, were cautious. They knew that Scout had come from a place of hardship, and they wanted to ensure that he wouldn't feel the need to retreat into his old habits of isolation. His father, in particular, was wary of how much time the dog would need and how much attention he would demand. "Liam," his dad said one evening after dinner, "we need to make sure Scout feels part of the family, but we can't let him take over everything. It's going to take time." Liam nodded, understanding. "I know, but he's already been through so much. He just needs a chance to be loved." His mother smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "And we'll be here for him, Liam, for both of you." For the first time in a long time, Liam felt like things might actually be okay. His parents, though unsure at first, were beginning to understand what Scout meant to him. They saw the change in their son, the way he was more open, more connected, and how the dog had helped him become someone who didn't just withdraw into his own world, but who could share love and kindness. One afternoon, Liam took Scout for a walk around the neighborhood. It was a short walk, just a few blocks, but it was the first time the dog had been outside since he'd come to live with them. Scout was nervous at first, his body tense, his steps slow, but Liam kept a steady pace, encouraging him with a soft voice. "Come on, Scout. You've got this," he said, giving the leash a gentle tug. With each step, Scout seemed to grow more confident. By the end of the walk, the dog was wagging his tail, his ears perked up, and his posture less stiff. It was a small victory, but to Liam, it felt monumental. They were both learning, growing, and healing together. When they returned home, Scout ran around the yard in excitement, his tail wagging furiously. It was a moment of pure joy, and Liam couldn't help but laugh, watching the dog's transformation unfold before his eyes. The journey was far from over, but they were well on their way. Life with Scout continued to evolve, and each day seemed to bring a new challenge. It wasn't that things were perfect, far from it, but they were real. Every step forward for Scout felt like a triumph. Every small setback a reminder of how far they still had to go. But the bond between Liam and Scout had grown undeniable, and with each passing day, they became more of a team. Scout was no longer the fearful, emaciated dog who had wandered the streets alone. He was becoming a real companion, albeit one who still had his fears. Sometimes, at the sound of a loud noise, a car honking, a door slamming, Scout would flinch, retreating to the corner of the room or hiding under the couch, his body trembling as though he feared something terrible was coming. But Liam had learned to be patient. He understood that Scout's past had left scars, ones that couldn't just be erased by a few weeks in a loving home. Each moment of panic was met with Liam's soft voice, his reassuring touch. "It's okay, Scout," he would whisper. "You're safe here. Nothing's going to hurt you." And more often than not, the dog would slowly emerge from his hiding place, eyes wide and cautious, but willing to trust again. Liam had never known how to calm someone with just his presence before, but with Scout, it came naturally. It wasn't just the dog who was healing. As the weeks passed, Liam found himself more open, more willing to share his thoughts, his feelings. He had always been a quiet child, content to keep his world to himself. But now, with Scout by his side, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. He started to talk more at school, raising his hand in class, participating in conversations with his classmates. But the transformation wasn't always smooth. There were moments of doubt, moments when Liam questioned if he was doing enough for Scout, or if the dog would ever fully recover from the trauma of his past. One evening, after a particularly tough day at school, Liam came home to find Scout looking withdrawn. The dog was curled up in his bed, his eyes unfocused, his body still. Something was off. Liam knelt beside him, running his hand gently over Scout's back. "Hey, buddy," Liam murmured. "What's going on? You okay?" Scout didn't respond. Liam frowned, running his fingers through the dog's fur. The animal's body felt unnaturally tense, his breathing shallow. Liam's heart skipped a beat. Was something wrong? Had Scout gotten sick? Panic gripped him as he quickly reached for the phone to call his mom. But then he paused. He took a deep breath, trying to push the panic down. Scout had been through so much. This wasn't just about a stomach ache or a small injury. This was about trust, about the deep emotional scars that Scout carried with him. Liam sat beside the dog, his hand still resting on Scout's back. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're not alone anymore." For what felt like an eternity, there was no change. Then, slowly, Scout shifted, lifting his head to look at Liam. His eyes were still tired, but there was a flicker of recognition in them, something that said he wasn't giving up. Liam stayed with him, waiting in silence. He wasn't going to rush it. He wasn't going to push Scout to heal faster than he could. The dog needed time. They both needed time. After a few minutes, Scout stood up and padded over to Liam's side, leaning into him for support. Liam smiled softly, gently stroking the dog's fur. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory. "You're doing great," Liam murmured, his voice full of pride. "We're both doing great." In that moment, Liam realized something important. Healing wasn't always linear. Sometimes progress was slow and messy. Sometimes there were setbacks. But as long as they had each other, they would get through it. And in this quiet, tender exchange between boy and dog, something profound settled into Liam's heart. He wasn't just taking care of Scout. He was learning how to take care of himself too. The days continued to pass, and life found its rhythm. Scout's fears still lingered, but each day he became more confident. The sound of a door slamming didn't make him retreat as quickly. The sudden burst of a car's engine didn't send him running. He was still sensitive, but the resilience in him was beginning to shine through. Liam, too, was changing. He was more open with his family, more engaged in the world around him. He felt less alone. The dog who had once been a stray, wandering the streets with no purpose, was now an integral part of Liam's life. And in turn, Scout had found a purpose too, being Liam's companion, his protector, and his best friend. And while there were still tough moments, Liam knew one thing for certain. Whatever they faced together, they would face it as a team. As winter began to recede, and the first hints of spring crept into the air, The changes in Scout were impossible to ignore. The once frightened, emaciated dog who had arrived at Liam's doorstep weeks earlier was now a completely different animal. His coat, once thin and patchy, was full and healthy, shining in the sunlight. His eyes, once clouded with fear, sparkled with energy and curiosity. His movements, once tentative and hesitant, were now confident and assured. Scout had become more than just a dog to Liam. He was a symbol of resilience, of second chances, and of the healing power of love. Every morning, Scout would greet Liam with boundless enthusiasm, his tail wagging furiously as if to say, "Good morning. I'm so glad we're together." And it wasn't just Liam who had noticed the transformation. His parents had started to see the change too. His mother, who had been a little cautious at first, now smiled whenever she saw Scout rolling on the floor, chasing his toys or playing fetch with Liam in the yard. His father, who had been skeptical, often found himself laughing at Scout's antics. He would chuckle when the dog playfully nudged him with his nose, or when Scout tried to crawl up onto the couch beside him, looking for a place to curl up. One Saturday afternoon, the family decided to take a trip to the local park. Liam was eager to bring Scout along, hoping that a day out in the open air would be another step toward the dog's full recovery. They packed a picnic, loaded into the car, and made their way to the park, with Scout sitting quietly in the backseat, his ears alert as he looked out the window. It was the first time Scout had been on a car ride since he had come to live with Liam, and the dog seemed both excited and curious, his tail wagging slowly. Once at the park, Liam unclipped Scout's leash, allowing him to explore the open space. The dog hesitated at first, his nose twitching as he took in the smells of fresh grass and earth, but then he took off running. It was a sight Liam would never forget, the sight of Scout, no longer burdened by fear, bounding across the grass with an unrestrained joy. He was free, truly free, for the first time in his life. Liam stood still, watching Scout run, feeling a sense of pride and wonder. Look at him, he thought. Look at what he's become. The dog had found his place in the world, and so had Liam. In the past, they had both been lost. Liam in his quiet, solitary life, Scout in a world of hunger and neglect. But now, they were each other's home, and together, they had built something strong. The day at the park was filled with laughter and play. Scout ran after a frisbee Liam tossed, his form graceful and agile as he leaped through the air to catch it. The dog was no longer just a survivor. He was a dog who lived with joy, who reveled in the simple pleasure of running with the wind in his fur. As the day drew to a close and the sun began to set, the family sat on a blanket, enjoying the picnic, with Scout lying contentedly at Liam's feet. His eyes were half closed in a peaceful sleep, his body relaxed and calm. Liam smiled down at him, reaching over to scratch the dog's ears. "You've come a long way, Scout," Liam whispered, his voice filled with emotion. Scout looked up at him with those bright, trusting eyes, and for a moment, Liam felt as though the entire world had aligned perfectly. He and the dog, two souls who had found each other in the most unexpected of ways. At that moment, Liam realized that it wasn't just Scout who had changed. It was him too. The boy who had once felt lonely and unsure, the boy who had kept to himself and withdrawn from the world, was now confident and full of love. He had found his voice, his purpose, and it had all begun with a small, starved dog who had needed someone to believe in him. As they packed up to leave the park, Liam felt a deep sense of contentment. Scout trotted alongside him, his leash gently held in Liam's hand. The boy could already see what the future held: more walks, more playtime, more quiet moments shared between them, and more lessons learned about life, love, and loyalty. Back home, as Liam opened the door to let Scout inside, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they had both undertaken. Life wasn't always easy. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear, but together, they had faced the hardest parts. And with Scout by his side, Liam knew there was nothing they couldn't face together. As the door closed behind them, Liam looked down at Scout, who was wagging his tail and sniffing around, eager to settle in for the night. "We've got this, buddy," Liam said softly, his heart full. "Together, we got this." And as the two of them curled up on the couch, Scout resting his head on Liam's lap, the boy knew that they were no longer just two lost souls. They were a family, bound by love, trust, and the promise of brighter days ahead.